The case presented is an emblematic book of the Catalan bibliographic heritage that allows us to open the debate on the failure of a minimal intervention, when it is not preceded by a correct analysis of the structural elements of the book. Originally, this codex was a part of the objects for liturgical use at Sant Jordi Chapel inside the Palau de la Generalitat, located in Barcelona and the seat of the Catalan government. Currently, after multiple historical vicissitudes, it is kept in the National Art Museum of Catalonia MNAC. It was printed in Paris in 1521 by Bernard Lesguire on a support of parchment. Once the work was acquired, the Generalitat commissioned the Florentine artist Giacomo Smeraldo Dotavanti to miniaturize it. It has a luxurious heraldic binding in the Renaissance mudéjar style. It has 5 double raised bands of alum leather, braided headbands and wooden tops covered with cordovan leather that is decorated in embossing and gold with ribbons, knots, ties. It is also embellished with 4 mosaics that represent the coat of arms of the Generalitat of Catalonia. The book cuts are gilded and chiseled with floral motifs. The body of the book parchment, the inks and pigments were in an acceptable state of conservation. We will omit the small alterations as well as the intervention process in these parts of the book in order to adhere to the time we have. We will focus only on the aspects concerning the binding. The main problem derived from the detachment of the front cover and the first signature from the body of the book. In addition to various leather disorders, the book would have been the subject of an intervention about 50 to 60 years ago. In this intervention, the loose leaves were sewn to some false raised bands, and some pieces of leather hinges were put on joining the covers to the spine. As can be seen in the image, they placed 5 false raised bands of 2-stranded hemp rope on the outside of the spine, which, running parallel to the original raised bands, pierce the first and last signatures, attaching themselves to the covers of the book. For this, they had to cut the bifolio that forms the W's by the edge of the fold. Lift the inner edge of the leather of both planes of the covers and of the fixed W's, exposing some spaces that allow the false raised bands to pass through the holes in the covers and lead them to the channels that house the ends of the original raised bands, and fix them there. Later, they adhered a very thin leather hinge between the edge of the spine and the edge of the covers, and a parchment hinge between the back cover and the first folio, linking, in this way, loose parchment signatures to the body of the book and attaching the covers to the spine by means of the false raised bands, the outer leather hinges and the inner parchment hinges. It is an intervention that is framed within the current philosophy of minimal intervention. However, after a few decades, the book presents similar alterations to those that were tried to solve at the time. The front cover and the first signature were totally separated. Our intervention proposal was based on the analysis of the constructive elements of the binding, the elements introduced in the previous restoration and the current alterations. The architectural structure of the original binding was intended to bind and protect a voluminous and heavy 335-fold parchment book, 375 by 265 millimeters. It was used by placing it on an altar lectern with an opening of 180, and an inclination that allowed the celebrant to read it from the vertical position. The weight, the blows and the friction, which originated in its transfer from the sacristy to the altar, together with the tensions produced during its opening, fell on the points of union of the raised bands and the headbands with the covers of the book. From its state of conservation, it can be deduced that it was used frequently during the period of time that it was liturgically active. A photograph from 1888 indicates that it was also used as a museum object, remaining fully open in a large display case. The intervention that had been made to resolve the separation of the covers from the body of the book is, on the one hand, as we have already mentioned, a very respectful intervention, and on the other, a solution that has been practiced for centuries. We have recently found it in two flexible parchment bindings from the early 17th century, as seen in the picture. However, in the case of our book, it's insufficient, since it does not take into account the real tensile force that occurs between the bulky parchment body and the heavy wooden covers during use and when opening the book on an inclined plane. Our intervention, while respecting the original structure of the binding, consisted in joining the separate pieces, front cover and first signature, and consolidating and reintegrating the binding leather. For the front cover we determined, for the reasons already explained, that structurally it was not enough to extend the 5 raised bands and join it to the spine of the book. To give this joint more consistency and stability, we devised a reinforcement system and extended the ends of the headbands, thus recovering their original function. This system of reinforcements very probably also recovers the original reinforcements of the book, since traces of parchment strips are preserved in the panel area between the bands. They were adhered to the spines of the signatures and would have functioned as reinforcements. First, we completely unadhere the leather hinge from the spine of the book. Next, we separated, as much as possible, the leather of the spine from the body of the book. Thus we were able to prolong the raised bands with some thin strips of alum leather, to which we sewed the first and last signatures with linen thread. We glued some strips of Japanese paper on the panel areas between the bands as traditional reinforcements, and other strips on the raised bands and their new extensions. We introduced these extensions, following the path of the original raised bands, up to the channels where the countertops are to house them. For them, it was necessary to lift the leather of the covers by the internal edge, the parchment hinge and affix W's by the edge of the spine, without yet adhering the raised bands extensions to the countertops. We consolidated and extended the headbands from end to end with a strip of alum leather, which we passed under the threads that fixed the core of the headband to the signatures. And we inserted the ends of these leather strips in both covers, which were lodged next to the broken ends of the original headbands. We fixed the new extensions of the raised bands and the headbands to the previous back cover, and then, the paper strips of the panel area between the bands. On the back cover we also fixed the ends of the headbands. Next, we took some new strips of Japanese paper that we dyed in a color similar to the leather of the binding, and we glued them, superimposing them to the already adhered ones, in all the panel area between the bands of the book. The free ends of these strips were fixed on the cover under the leather of the binding. We completed the gaps with the same Japanese paper and replaced from the previous restoration both the parchment hinge and the leather hinge, although the latter did not perform any function in its edges mounted on the original leather of the binding. It was part of its site of vitae and maintains an aesthetic balance with the backplane of the binding, in which the other built-in hinge is maintained. Afterwards, we consolidated and reintegrated with the same Japanese paper the caps and other lost or torn areas of the leather of the binding, as well as the leather of the mosaic of one of the heraldic shields. We colored these reintegrations of the leather in a chromatic tonality that would match the lost leather. Finally, to prevent the rusty ends of the nails that fixed the closures from continuing to pierce the parchment doublures, we lifted the fixed doublures at the oxidation points, cut the tips of the nails, impregnated it with a tannin alcohol solution, and later we covered it with Japanese paper and re-adhered it. A minimal intervention has become a kind of guarantee label that certifies that our interventions are correctly executed. However, neither the minimal intervention is possible in all cases nor the fact that it is carried out is an indicator by itself that the intervention is correct.